Miss Marple and the 3 widows murdered in 1 week. The village of St. Mary Mead had always prided itself on its tranquility. That particular brand of English countryside peace were the most exciting event of any given week. Might be Mrs. Bantry's rose winning first prize at the flower show, or the vicar's wife serving an unexpectedly adventurous curry at the church social. It was the sort of place where everyone knew everyone else's business or thought they didn't, where the rhythm of life moved to the gentle tick of the church clock and the more urgent rhythm of village gossip. It was on a crisp October morning, when the leaves were turning that particularly English shade of russet and gold, that the tranquility shattered like fine china dropped on flagstones. Miss Jane Marple was in her garden, attending to her Michaelmas daisies with the focused attention she brought to all her pursuits. When she heard the commotion, her cottage sat at an advantageous position on the high street, affording her quite coincidentally, she would assure anyone who asked, an excellent view of the village's daily movements. The raised voices and the sound of running feet were most unusual for 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her oldest friend, came hurrying up the garden path with more speed than dignity, her face flushed and her hat askew. "Jane, Jane, the most dreadful thing, you must come at once." Miss Marple set down her gardening shears with calm deliberation, removed her gardening gloves, and turned her mild blue eyes upon her friend. "My dear Dolly, do catch your breath. What has happened?" "It's Mrs. Fortescue. Agnes Fortescue. She's been found dead in her cottage. Dr. Haydock is there now, and Colonel Melchett has been sent for. They're saying," Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice to a theatrical whisper, though there was no one else in the garden to hear, "they're saying it's murder." Miss Marple's expression remained composed, though her eyes sharpened with interest. "Indeed, how very distressing. Mrs. Agnes Fortescue, you say? The widow who moved here 3 years ago from Torquay?" "The very same." "Oh, Jane, it's too dreadful. And in St. Mary Mead, of all places." "Murder can happen anywhere, my dear," Miss Marple observed gently. "Human nature is much the same, whether in a village or a city. But perhaps we should walk over there. I'm sure poor Mrs. Fortescue had few enough friends here. Someone should represent the village properly." The 2 women made their way down the high street, where they found a small crowd had already gathered outside Rose Cottage, a neat little dwelling with a blue painted door and window boxes still bright with late blooming geraniums. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, was standing in the doorway speaking to Police Constable Powell, his round face grave and his usual joviality entirely absent. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry," he said as they approached. "Terrible business, terrible. I've just been explaining to Polk. Here Mrs. Fortescue was found by her daily woman, Mrs. Crump, at 8:30 this morning. Appears to have died some time last evening. I've sent word to the Chief Constable." "How did she die, Doctor?" Miss Marple inquired in her gentle voice. Dr. Haydock hesitated, then seemed to decide that in a village, discretion was ultimately futile. "Poison, I believe. All the signs point to it, though I'll need to wait for the post-mortem to be certain. But the symptoms are quite characteristic. Possibly digitalis, or something similar." "How very singular," Miss Marple murmured. "Mrs. Fortescue had a heart condition, did she not? I seem to recall she mentioned it at the last church fete." "She did, indeed," Dr. Haydock confirmed. "She was on medication for it, digitalis, as it happens, which makes this rather complicated. Could have been an accidental overdose, but there are certain indications that suggest otherwise. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Around them, the crowd was growing, and with it, the hum of speculation and alarm. She recognized most of the faces. Miss Hartnell, the village busybody, practically quivering with the importance of the news. Young artist Peter Devlin, who rented the studio flat above the post office. Mrs. Price Ridley, the magistrate's widow, looking appropriately severe, and several others, their expressions ranging from shocked to grimly fascinated. 3 years she lived here, Miss Hartnell was announcing to anyone who would listen, and never really became part of the village, if you know what I mean. Kept herself to herself. Always thought there was something odd about that. A woman with secrets, mark my words. Now, said Colonel Bantry, who had joined the gathering. Let's not jump to conclusions. Poor woman's barely cold, and you're assassinating her character. I'm doing no such thing. Miss Hartnell bridled. I'm merely observing that she was a very private person. And you must admit, Colonel, it is strange. A wealthy widow, living alone in a village where she knew no one. With no family to speak of, she had a nephew, Miss Marple interjected quietly, and Mr. Stephen Fortescue. I believe he visited her once or twice. A stockbroker in London. Everyone turned to look at her. Miss Marple had the remarkable quality of being simultaneously present and unnoticed until she chose to speak, at which point it became apparent that she had been paying attention to everything. How do you know that, Miss Marple? Asked Dr. Haydock with a smile. Oh, she mentioned it in the post office. About 6 months ago, I believe. She was sending a rather expensive-looking parcel to London, and Mrs. Harker commented on it. Mrs. Fortescue explained it was a birthday gift for her nephew. At that moment, a large official car pulled up, and Chief Constable Colonel Melchett emerged, along with a younger man in plain clothes whom Miss Marple didn't recognize. The crowd parted deferentially as they made their way to the cottage door. Melchett's brought Inspector Slack from Much Benham. Colonel Bantry observed, "Must be taking this seriously." Inspector Slack was a sharp-faced man with the aggressive manner of someone determined to prove himself. He disappeared into the cottage with Colonel Melchett and Dr. Haydock, leaving the crowd to continue their speculation. "Mark my words," said Mrs. Price Ridley in her authoritative manner. "This will be a domestic matter. These things always are. Some relative with an eye on her money, or perhaps a servant with a grudge. Mrs. Crump has been her daily woman for 2 years, observed Miss Marple mildly. A most reliable person. She has a sick mother she tends to with great devotion. I can't imagine her harboring murderous intentions toward anyone." Then the nephew, Mrs. Price Ridley, said decisively, "These London businessmen are always desperate for money. I read about it in the newspapers." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes had taken on that faraway look that her friends recognized, the look that meant she was comparing the present situation to something from her vast mental catalogue of human behavior observed over 7 decades of village life. As the crowd began reluctantly to disperse, Miss Marple remained, ostensibly admiring the geraniums in the window boxes, but actually observing the cottage and its surroundings with minute attention. Rose Cottage was isolated at the end of a small lane, with a high hedge on one side and open fields on the other. Anyone could have approached it the previous evening without being observed. "Coming along, Jane," Mrs. Bantry called. "In a moment, dear," Miss Marple replied. "I was just thinking these geraniums are remarkably healthy for this time of year. Someone has been taking excellent care of them." It was a seemingly innocuous observation, But as she made her way slowly home, Miss Marple's mind was working with its customary precision. Mrs. Fortescue had been a wealthy widow, living alone on medication that could prove fatal in excess. She had kept largely to herself, but she had a nephew in London, and someone had cared enough about her garden to tend it carefully, even as autumn approached. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was endlessly fascinating, and in her experience, murder was almost always about one of three things: love, money, or fear. Sometimes all three. The question was, which was it this time? And even as she settled into her chair to consider the matter, she had no idea that this was merely the first act in a drama that would claim 2 more lives before the week was out by tea time that afternoon. The entire village of St. Mary Mead was humming with speculation like a disturbed beehive. Miss Marple, who had been invited to tea at the vicarage, or rather, had tactfully arranged to be invited, found herself in the centre of the most animated discussion the village had witnessed in years. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was a sensible woman with a practical turn of mind, but even she seemed somewhat overwhelmed by the day's events. "I simply cannot believe it," she said, pouring tea with a slightly unsteady hand. "Murder in St. Mary Mead. It seems quite impossible, and yet," observed Miss Marple, accepting her cup with a gentle smile, "it has happened. Which means, my dear Griselda, that it was not only possible, but actual. Human nature being what it is, I'm afraid murder is always possible, anywhere. But who could have done such a thing?" Griselda Clement protested. Mrs. Fortescue was a harmless old woman. Well, perhaps not old. She was only 60 or so, but you know what I mean. Who would want to kill her? "And yet," observed Miss Marple, accepting her cup with a gentle smile, "it has happened. Which means, my dear Griselda, that it was not only possible, but actual. Human." Mrs. Fortescue was a harmless old woman. Well, perhaps not old. She was only 60 or so, but you know what I mean. Who would want to kill her? "That," said Miss Marple, "is indeed the question. Though I have found, over the years, that the question of who benefits from a death is often more illuminating than the question of who might have disliked the deceased." The vicar himself entered at that moment, his gentle face troubled. "I've just come from Rose Cottage," he announced. "Inspector Slack asked me to identify certain items. Apparently Mrs. Fortescue had several pieces of religious art, and he wanted to know if any might have come from the church. They hadn't, of course, but I did learn something rather interesting. It appears Mrs. Fortescue was quite wealthy, far wealthier than anyone in the village suspected." "How wealthy?" Miss Marple asked with delicate interest. Inspector Slack mentioned a figure of some £50,000, the vicar said. "Possibly more. She had investments, property in Torquay, and a considerable amount in securities." He seemed to think this might be relevant. £50,000, Griselda exclaimed. "Good heavens! And she lived in that tiny cottage." "Some people prefer a simple life," Miss Marple observed. "Though I must say, it does rather change the picture. With that much money at stake, the nephew becomes a person of considerable interest, Stephen Fortescue." The vicar looked surprised. "I understood he was quite successful in his own right. Surely he wouldn't need to murder his aunt for money." "People," Miss Marple said gently, "have murdered for far less. And success in business doesn't always mean one has ready money. I remember a case in the village years ago, Mr. Hargraves, who seemed so prosperous with his motor car and his fine clothes. When he died, It turned out he was mortgaged to the hilt. His son had been expecting a fortune and inherited nothing but debts. You think the nephew did it then? Griselda asked. I think nothing yet, my dear. It's far too early for that. But I do think it would be interesting to know more about Mr. Stephen Fortescue's circumstances. As if summoned by the conversation, there was a knock at the vicarage door, and the maid showed in none other than Stephen Fortescue himself. He was a man in his late 30s, well dressed in a dark suit that suggested both prosperity and good taste, with a lean, intelligent face and dark hair touched with grey at the temples. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he carried himself with the stiff dignity of someone holding grief at bay through sheer force of will. Vicar, he said, his voice rough, I hope I'm not intruding. I've just arrived from London, drove straight through when the police telephoned. They said I should speak with you about the funeral arrangements. My dear fellow, of course, the vicar said, rising to shake his hand. Please, sit down. This is my wife, Griselda, and Miss Marple, one of our parishioners. Stephen Fortescue nodded to them both, then sank into a chair as though his legs could no longer support him. I can't believe it, he said. Aunt Agnes, it's incomprehensible. Who would do such a thing? She never harmed anyone in her life. You were close to your aunt, Mr. Fortescue. Miss Marple inquired gently. He looked at her with a flash of what might have been guilt. Not as close as I should have been, he admitted. I visited when I could, but London is demanding, and well, there's no excuse, really. I should have come more often, and now it's too late. When did you last see her? Miss Marple asked. About 2 months ago. I came down for a weekend. She seemed in excellent spirits, talked about the garden, the village, events. Everything seemed perfectly normal, and she never mentioned being worried about anything. Or anyone. Stephen Fortescue frowned. No, nothing like that. Although, he hesitated. Yes. Miss Marple prompted softly. It's probably nothing. But she did mention that she'd been receiving some rather odd letters. Anonymous letters, I gathered. She laughed about them, said every village had its poison pen, and she wasn't going to give whoever it was the satisfaction of being upset. Poison pen letters. The vicar looked shocked. In St. Mary Mead. I had no idea such a thing was happening. Mrs. Fortescue wasn't the only one, Miss Marple said quietly. I believe Mrs. Carmichael received several about 3 months ago. She mentioned it to me at the church. She was most distressed. And I think Miss Lavinia Price may have received one as well, though she didn't speak of it directly. One notices these things. What sort of letters? Stephen Fortescue asked sharply. The usual sort, I'm afraid, Miss Marple said. Nasty accusations, vague threats, the kind of thing that's designed to cause maximum distress. Mrs. Carmichael suggested she had married her late husband for his money, which was quite absurd. They had been devoted to each other for 40 years. Do you think the letters could be connected to my aunt's death? Stephen Fortescue demanded. It's certainly a possibility, Miss Marple acknowledged, though one must be careful not to jump to conclusions. Still, I think Inspector Slack should certainly be informed about them. The conversation continued for some time, with Stephen Fortescue providing what details he could about his aunt's life and habits. He confirmed that he was her sole heir, which he stated with obvious discomfort, as though aware how it made him appear. He also mentioned that his aunt had been in correspondence with someone in the village, though he didn't know whom. He had noticed several letters in her writing desk addressed to M, but had assumed it was simply a friend. after he left, promising to call on Inspector Slack immediately with the information about the poison pen letters. Miss Marple sat quietly for a moment, her fingers knitting automatically, while her mind worked through what she had learned. "What do you think, Miss Marple?" Griselda asked eagerly. "Do you think he did it?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that he is genuinely grieved by his aunt's death. Whether that grief is the result of affection or guilt, I cannot yet say. But there is something he isn't telling. I'm quite certain of that." "How can you tell?" the vicar asked with interest. "Oh, it's the way he hesitated before mentioning the letters," Miss Marple explained. "He had to think about whether to tell us, which suggests there might be other things he's chosen not to mention. And there's the question of these mysterious letters to M. Who in the village has a name beginning with M?" "Well, there's Dr. Morris," Griselda suggested, "and Mrs. Marston, who runs the lending library, and Major Murray, who retired here last year. Oh, and Mary Pritchard, the schoolteacher." "Quite a selection," Miss Marple murmured. "I think perhaps a visit to the lending library might be in order tomorrow. Mrs. Marston knows everyone's business. Rather unavoidable when one handles everyone's reading material, but Miss Marple's plans for a quiet investigation were destined to be interrupted in the most shocking way possible. For at 9 o'clock that evening, just as she was settling down with her knitting and the evening paper, there came a frantic knocking at her door. It was Police Constable Pop, his face pale in the lamplight. "Miss Marple," he gasped, "I'm to ask you to come at once. There's been another one. Another murder. Mrs. Carmichael found dead in her sitting room not half an hour ago. Poisoned, just like Mrs. Fortescue." Miss Marple set down her knitting with careful precision, though her heart was beating rather faster than usual. "Mrs. Carmichael, are you quite certain?" "As certain as can be, ma'am. Dr. Haydock's with her now, and Inspector Slack is in a rare state. 2 murders in one day, he says it's the work of a madman." But as Miss Marple gathered her coat and hat, she was thinking that it was nothing of the sort. Madmen killed at random, following the twisted logic of their own delusions. These murders, if they were indeed connected, showed planning and purpose to wealthy widows, both poisoned within hours of each other. The question was, why? And more urgently, would there be a third? As she hurried through the dark village streets toward Mrs. Carmichael's house, Miss Marple's mind was already at work, sorting through possibilities and connections. She had a terrible suspicion that before this matter was resolved, her fears about a third victim would prove all too prophetic. Mrs. Carmichael's house, Meadowbank, was a substantial Victorian villa set back from the road behind a well-maintained hedge. When Miss Marple arrived, she found the scene distressingly similar to that morning's tragedy at Rose Cottage. The police car, the cluster of curious onlookers, the air of shocked disbelief. Inspector Slack emerged from the front door as she approached, his sharp features set in lines of frustration. He was a man who liked his cases neat and quickly solved, and this investigation was proving neither. "Miss Marple," he said with barely concealed impatience, "I don't know what Constable Pock was thinking, fetching you here. This is police business, of course, Inspector." Miss Marple replied with her gentle smile, "Though I understand Mrs. Carmichael and I were friends, I thought, perhaps, I might be of some assistance in identifying whether anything was disturbed or missing." Inspector Slack opened his mouth, clearly prepared to refuse, but Colonel Melchett emerged behind him and interrupted. "Actually, Slack, that's not a bad idea. Miss Marple knows the village and its inhabitants better than any of us. Let her have a look." The inspector's jaw tightened, but he stood aside. "Very well, but don't touch anything." The scene inside was grimly familiar. Mrs. Carmichael sat in her favorite. At first glance, she might have been sleeping, but the peculiar waxy quality of her skin and the contorted expression on her face told a different story. Dr. Haydock looked up from his examination as Miss Marple entered. "Same as before, I'm afraid," he said heavily. "All the signs of poisoning I'd stake my reputation. It's digitalis again. Likely administered in her tea." He gestured to a delicate china tea service on the table beside the chair. The cup still half full. Miss Marple stood very still, her eyes moving methodically round the room. It was a comfortable, well-appointed space, filled with the accumulation of a long and comfortable life. Photographs in silver frames, a collection of Staffordshire dogs on the mantelpiece, shelves lined with books. Nothing appeared disturbed. "When was she found?" Miss Marple asked. Her companion, Miss Bright, discovered her at approximately 8 o'clock, Inspector Slack replied. Miss Bright had been out visiting her sister in Much Benham for the day she returned to find Mrs. Carmichael deceased. She'd been dead several hours, according to the doctor. "Where is Miss Bright now?" "In the morning room, being attended to by Mrs. Bantry. She's quite distraught, as you might imagine." Miss Marple nodded slowly, then moved closer to examine the tea service. It was a beautiful set, Sèvres porcelain with a pattern of roses. The teapot still held a small amount of cold tea, and beside the cup was a small plate with the remains of a slice of cake. "Was Mrs. Carmichael expecting anyone for tea?" she asked. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. "Miss Bright says not. Mrs. Carmichael had intended to spend a quiet afternoon with her book. She often took tea alone in the afternoon, but she has used her good china," Miss Marple observed. "And there is cake. One doesn't usually go to such trouble when one is alone." Inspector Slack frowned, looking at the tea service with new interest. "You're suggesting she had a visitor? It seems likely, doesn't it? Unless Mrs. Carmichael habitually used her best china, even when alone, which would be rather unusual. We'll need to question the servants," Inspector Slack said. "Making a note, I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that Mrs. Carmichael employed only a cook and a housemaid, both of whom live out. They would have left by 4 o'clock. That was the usual arrangement." She moved to the writing desk by the window and stood looking at it thoughtfully. It was neat and orderly, with a leather blotter, a pen stand, and a small stack of correspondence. Among the letters, Miss Marple noticed an envelope addressed in a rather crude hand, the sort of hand that suggested someone unaccustomed to writing. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe this may be one of the poison pen letters I mentioned to Mr. Fortescue." Inspector Slack crossed the room in 2 strides and picked up the envelope with his handkerchief. He extracted the letter, a single sheet of cheap paper with words cut from newspapers and magazines pasted onto it. The message was brief and vicious. "Thieves don't deserve to prosper. You'll get what's coming to you." "Good Lord," Colonel Melchett exclaimed, reading over the inspector's shoulder. "When did she receive this?" "I couldn't say," Miss Marple replied, "though it appears to be among her current correspondence. So presumably recently. Mrs. Carmichael mentioned receiving poison pen letters some months ago, but I believe they had stopped her. So she had said, or she'd stopped talking about them." Dr. Haydock observed grimly. "This is addressed to her as a thief. What could that possibly mean?" Mary Carmichael was one of the most respectable women in the village. "Respectability," Miss Marple said quietly, is not always the same as innocence. We all have our secrets, Doctor, even the most respectable among us. Inspector Slack was examining the letter with intense concentration. This could be from anyone. The words are cut from a newspaper, probably the local Gazette, judging by the typeface. Envelopes are common type, available at any post office. Postmark is smudged, but I think it's local. May I see the other letters on the desk? Miss Marple asked. With visible reluctance, Inspector Slack handed them over. Miss Marple examined them carefully. There was a letter from Mrs. Carmichael's solicitor in London, one from a charity requesting a donation, and one, this was interesting, from a ladies' travel agency, confirming a booking for a Mediterranean cruise departing in 3 weeks' time. Mrs. Carmichael was planning to travel. Miss Marple asked. Apparently so, Inspector Slack said. Is that significant? It might be. It suggests she was not unduly worried about the poison pen letters. One doesn't plan an extended holiday if one feels threatened. Unless, of course, she was planning to escape something. Miss Marple moved to examine the bookshelves, running her eyes along the titles with the practiced ease of a fellow book lover. Most were exactly what one would expect. Novels, biographies, some poetry. But one volume caught her attention, a leather-bound ledger, rather out of place among the literary works. Inspector, might I look at this? What is it? I'm not certain. An accounts book of some kind, perhaps. Inspector Slack took it and opened it. His eyebrows rose. It's a record of investments. Quite detailed, too. Shows purchases and sales of stocks over the past several years. He flipped through the pages. Good Lord, the woman was an active trader. Made quite a profit too, by the look of it. How much? Colonel Melchett asked. Difficult to say exactly, but it must run into thousands of pounds. She was quite shrewd, bought low, sold high. Made particularly well during the war. It seems Miss Marple had moved to the fireplace and was looking at a photograph in a silver frame. It showed a group of 4 women, all dressed in the fashion of some 20 years earlier, standing together on what appeared to be a hotel terrace. They were all smiling, raising champagne glasses to the camera. Who are these ladies? She asked. Dr. Haydock peered at the photograph. That's Mary Carmichael, on the left, much younger, of course. And unless I'm very much mistaken, that's Agnes Fortescue next to her. There was a moment of electric silence. Mrs. Fortescue and Mrs. Carmichael knew each other before they came to St. Mary Mead. Inspector Slack's voice was sharp with interest. It would appear so, Miss Marple said quietly. I wonder who the other 2 ladies are. Dr. Haydock shook his head. I don't recognize them. We'll need to identify them, Inspector Slack said. This could be important. 2 women in that photograph are now dead, both poisoned in the same way, both within hours of each other. That's no coincidence. No, Miss Marple agreed. It most certainly isn't. I think, Inspector, we are dealing with something rather more complex than a simple case of murder for inheritance. There is a pattern here, but we haven't yet seen all of it. Pattern. Inspector Slack looked skeptical. What sort of pattern? That, said Miss Marple, is what we need to discover. But I have a terrible feeling that if we don't discover it quickly, there may be another death. If there were 4 friends in that photograph, and 2 are now dead. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the implication. We need to find out who those other 2 women are, Colonel Melchett said decisively, and we need to find them quickly. I might be able to help with that, Miss Marple said. If I might borrow this photograph to show around the village, someone may recognize them." Inspector Slack looked as though he wanted to refuse, but Colonel Melchett nodded. "Good idea, Miss Marple. Slack, have one of your men photograph it first for the records, then let Miss Marple take it. She can get more information out of the villagers in an hour than we could in a week." As Miss Marple left Meadowbank half an hour later, the photograph safely in her handbag, her mind was working furiously. Two wealthy widows, connected by a friendship from the past, both murdered on the same day. Both had received poison pen letters. Both had been living quietly in the village, seemingly without enemies, but someone had hated them enough to kill them. Someone who knew about their past connection. Someone who had access to digitalis and the knowledge of how to use it lethally. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, there might be two more women whose lives were in immediate danger. Miss Marple walked home through the dark streets, but she didn't go inside. Instead, she walked to the vicarage and rang the bell. When Griselda Clement answered, still dressed despite the late hour, Miss Marple said without preamble, "My dear, I need to ask you some questions about the ladies in the village, particularly any who are widows, wealthy, and approximately 60 to 65 years of age. It's rather urgent." Griselda's eyes widened as she took in Miss Marple's serious expression. "You'd better come in. I'll make some coffee. This is about the murders, isn't it?" "I'm afraid so," Miss Marple said, "and I'm very much afraid that unless we're very clever and very quick, we're going to have at least one more murder to investigate." The next morning dawned grey and drizzling, the sort of persistent English rain that seemed designed to match the village's somber mood. Miss Marple had slept little, her mind too active with theories and possibilities, and she was at her window by 7 o'clock, watching the village wake to the news of a second murder. By the time she had finished breakfast, Mrs. Bantry had arrived, bursting with information and barely suppressed excitement. For all her genuine distress at the murders, Dolly Bantry couldn't quite suppress her fascination with the drama unfolding in their quiet village. "Jane, you'll never guess what I've learned. I was with Miss Bright until nearly midnight last night. The poor woman was quite distraught, and she told me the most extraordinary thing. Mrs. Carmichael had a visitor yesterday afternoon. Someone came to the house around 3 o'clock, but Miss Bright doesn't know who it was because she'd already left to visit her sister." "How does she know someone came, then?" Miss Marple asked, pouring her friend a cup of tea. "The cook." "Cook was just leaving you. No, she leaves at 4 on Wednesdays, and she saw someone going up the front path. She didn't see who it was clearly because of the rain starting, just a figure with an umbrella. But she assumed it was someone Mrs. Carmichael was expecting, so she thought nothing of it." "Did she mention any distinguishing features? Man or woman? Tall or short?" "She thought it was a woman, based on the walk and the way the umbrella was held, but she couldn't be certain. Medium height, wearing a dark coat. That's all she could say." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, which could describe half the women in the village. "Exactly. Inspector Slack is furious. He questioned Cook for nearly an hour this morning, but she couldn't tell him anything more useful. He's convinced it was the murderer, of course." "It seems likely," Miss Marple agreed. "Someone came to take tea with Mrs. Carmichael, someone she trusted enough to use her good china for, and that someone poisoned her tea. The question is, who did Mrs. Carmichael trust that much?" "Well, she was friendly with quite a few people in the village," Mrs. Bantry said. She and Miss Lavinia Price were close. They played bridge together every Thursday. And she was on good terms with Mrs. Harper Jones and with Diana Marsden from the lending library. Oh, and she was very friendly with Miss Emily Barton. They were both interested in local history. Miss Marple had been listening carefully, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. At the mention of Miss Lavinia Price, her hands had paused almost imperceptibly before continuing. "Tell me about Miss Price," she said quietly. "Lavinia." "Oh, she's been in the village about 5 years. Widow, no children. Lives very comfortably in that pretty little house on the edge of the village, Primrose Cottage, I think it's called. She's about 60, I should say. Very refined, musical. She gives piano lessons to some of the village children." "Why, I'm not certain," Miss Marple said. "But I recall Mrs. Fortescue mentioning Miss Price once or twice. I had the impression they knew each other, though not well." "Do you think Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened? Do you think she might be one of the women in the photograph?" "I think," said Miss Marple, rising to fetch the photograph from her bureau, "that we should find out. Would you recognize Miss Price if you saw her 20 years younger?" The two women studied the photograph together. The 4 ladies in it were all slender, elegantly dressed, clearly enjoying themselves. Besides the younger versions of Agnes, Fortescue, and Mary Carmichael, there were 2 others, one with dark hair and a rather aristocratic bearing, the other fair-haired with a rounder face and a sweet expression. "It's so difficult to tell," Mrs. Bantry said uncertainly. "People change so much. But that one," she pointed to the fair-haired woman. "There's something about the eyes and the shape of the face. It could be Lavinia Price, I suppose, though I couldn't swear to it." "Nor could I," Miss Marple admitted. "But I think perhaps I should pay Miss Price a visit. Would you care to accompany me?" "Nothing would keep me away," Mrs. Bantry declared. But before they could leave, there was another knock at the door. This time it was Stephen Fortescue, looking as though he hadn't slept at all. His face was drawn, and there was a feverish intensity in his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "I need to speak with you. May I come in?" "Of course, Mr. Fortescue." Miss Marple gestured to a chair. "You've heard about Mrs. Carmichael?" "Yes. Inspector Slack sent word to my hotel this morning. He seems to think there's a connection to my aunt's murder." He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "Miss Marple, I haven't been entirely honest with you. There's something I didn't mention yesterday, something I should have told the inspector, but I was afraid of how it would look." "Go on," Miss Marple said gently. "The truth is, I didn't just come down to visit my aunt 2 months ago. I came because I needed money. Rather desperately, actually. I'd made some unfortunate investment stocks that I was certain would rise, but which crashed instead. I was facing significant losses, and I'd borrowed money that I couldn't repay. I asked Aunt Agnes for a loan, and did she give it to you?" Miss Marple asked. "No." His voice was bitter. "She refused." "Oh, she was kind about it. Said she couldn't help because her capital was tied up in long-term investments that she couldn't liquidate without penalty. But I didn't believe her. I thought she was just being tight-fisted, putting her money ahead of her own family. We parted on rather bad terms." "I see," Miss Marple said. "And you're telling me this now because Inspector Slack is going to find out anyway. He's already been making inquiries about my financial situation in London. I wanted you to hear it from me first. But I swear to you, I didn't kill my aunt. Despite our argument, I cared for her, and I certainly had no reason to kill Mrs. Carmichael. I'd never even met the woman." But you knew your aunt and Mrs. Carmichael were acquainted? Miss Marple asked, watching him carefully. Stephen Fortescue looked confused. Were they? I had no idea. My aunt never mentioned it. Either he was an excellent actor, Miss Marple thought, or he was genuinely surprised. She showed him the photograph. This was taken approximately 20 years ago. That's your aunt, and this is Mrs. Carmichael. Do you recognize either of the other two women? He studied the photograph intently, then shook his head. No, I've never seen them before. Where was this taken? That's what we're trying to determine. There's writing on the back. Miss Marple turned it over. It says, Monte Carlo, April 1930. Does that mean anything to you? Monte Carlo? No, nothing. Though he hesitated. I do remember my uncle, Aunt Agnes's husband, once mentioning that she'd travelled abroad extensively before they were married. He made some joke about her being quite the adventuress in her youth. I didn't think anything of it at the time, after Stephen Fortescue left, looking somewhat relieved to have unburdened himself. Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple with wide eyes. Do you believe him? I believe he's genuinely troubled, Miss Marple said carefully. Whether that's because he's guilty or because he's afraid of being suspected, I cannot yet say. But there's something else bothering me about all this. What's that? Monte Carlo in 1930. That was during the height of the gambling season. For young women, apparently traveling together, staying at what looks like an expensive hotel. How did they fund such a trip? Women of that era didn't generally have the independent means for that sort of luxury travel, unless they were very wealthy indeed. Perhaps they were wealthy. Mrs. Bantry suggested. Perhaps, Miss Marple said. Or perhaps they had other means of acquiring money. You remember what that poison pen letter said? Thieves don't deserve to prosper. What if that wasn't just spite? What if it was true? Mrs. Bantry gasped. You think they were criminals? I think, Miss Marple said slowly, that for young women in Monte Carlo in 1930 might have been involved in something not entirely respectable. And I think that whatever they did, someone has neither forgotten nor forgiven. Someone who is now systematically killing them, one by one. Then we must warn the others. Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. If there are 2 more women from that photograph still alive, they're in terrible danger. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, which is why we need to identify them immediately. And that's why we're going to visit Miss Lavinia Price right now. If she's one of the 4, she may be the next victim. And if she isn't, she may know who is. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused at her door, a thoughtful expression on her face. There's something else that troubles me, she said. If this is revenge for something that happened 20 years ago, why now? What triggered the killer to act at this particular moment? That's the question that may unlock everything. They set out into the drizzle, 2 elderly ladies, on what appeared to be a social call, but was actually a race against time. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a murderer was planning the next strike. And somewhere, perhaps unaware of the danger, a woman was going about her daily routine. Not knowing that death was closing in, Miss Marple pulled her coat more tightly around her shoulders and quickened her pace. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that the past was never truly past, and that secrets, no matter how carefully buried, had a way of rising to the surface. The only question was, would they solve this mystery before the killer struck again? Primrose Cottage sat at the far end of the village, a charming Georgian structure with yellow-painted shutters and a garden that, even in October, showed signs of careful tending. As Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry approached, they could hear the sound of piano music drifting through an open window choppin. Played with considerable skill. The music stopped when they knocked, and after a brief pause, the door was opened by Miss Lavinia Price herself. She was a handsome woman of about 60, with silver hair elegantly coiffed and intelligent grey eyes. She wore a simple but well-cut dress in dove grey, with a beautiful cameo brooch at her throat. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple," she said with a smile. "What a pleasant surprise. Do come in out of the rain." The interior of Primrose Cottage was as elegant as its mistress, furnished with excellent taste but without ostentation. Watercolors adorned the walls, and a magnificent grand piano dominated the sitting room. There were books everywhere, suggesting a cultivated mind. "We won't keep you long," Miss Marple said, as they were settled with tea and biscuits. "But I'm afraid we've come on rather a serious matter. You've heard about the murders, of course." Miss Price's face grew grave. "Yes, terrible, terrible. Poor Mrs. Fortescue and Mrs. Carmichael. I can't imagine who would do such a thing. Did you know that the police came to see me yesterday evening? Inspector Slack wanted to know if I'd been to visit Mrs. Carmichael, which, of course, I hadn't. I was here all afternoon, giving piano lessons to the Weatherby children. You knew both of the victims?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Not well, Mrs. Fortescue. I'd met only a few times. We occasionally encountered each other at church or in the village shop. Mrs. Carmichael, I knew rather better. We played bridge together weekly. She was an excellent player, very strategic in her thinking." Miss Price paused, her eyes filling with tears. "I shall miss her." Miss Marple withdrew the photograph from her handbag. "Miss Price, I wonder if I might ask you to look at this photograph and tell me if you recognize anyone in it." Miss Price took the photograph, and for a moment her face went absolutely still. The color drained from her cheeks, and her hand trembled slightly. It was only for an instant, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the reaction. "Where did you get this?" Miss Price asked, her voice carefully controlled. "It was in Mrs. Carmichael's house. That's Mrs. Carmichael on the left, and Mrs. Fortescue beside her. Do you recognize the other two ladies?" Miss Price was silent for a long moment, studying the photograph. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "Yes, I recognize them. This one," she pointed to the fair-haired woman, "is me. 20 years younger, of course, but me nonetheless. And this," her finger moved to the dark-haired woman, "is Emily Barton, Miss Emily Barton, who lives in the village." Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, "Yes, we knew each other long ago, though we hadn't seen each other for nearly 20 years until we both happened to move to St. Mary Mead. Quite a coincidence." "Really, or not a coincidence at all," Miss Marple suggested gently. "For friends from the past, all settling in the same small village within a few years of each other. That suggests a deliberate choice, doesn't it?" Miss Price set down the photograph with great care and folded her hands in her lap. "You're quite right, of course. We agreed to settle here. It was Mary's idea, actually. Mrs. Carmichael, I mean. She'd visited St. Mary Mead and thought it would be ideal for us. A quiet place where we could live comfortably and peacefully. Agnes came first, then Mary, then me about 5 years ago. Emily was the last, about 3 years ago. Why?" Miss Marple asked simply. Miss Price looked at her for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "Because we wanted to be near each other in our later years." We'd been close friends once, you see. We'd been through something together. Something that bonded us in a way that ordinary friendship doesn't. In Monte Carlo, Miss Marple prompted, indicating the writing on the back of the photograph. Yes, in Monte Carlo, in the spring of 1930, Miss Price's voice was distant, remembering. We were all young then, in our late 30s, all widows with small incomes and limited prospects. We'd met at a rather dismal hotel in London and discovered we all dreamed of something more exciting than the dreary lives we were living. So we pooled our resources and went to Monte Carlo for 3 weeks. It was glorious. And while you were there, Miss Marple asked, Miss Price's eyes met hers directly. While we were there, we did something rather foolish. Something we weren't proud of, but which seemed justified at the time. There was a man, a wealthy American, a gambler. He'd won a great deal of money at the casino, and he was boasting about it to anyone who would listen. Thousands and thousands of francs. He was also drunk, and making himself objectionable to women, including us. What did you do? Mrs. Bantry asked, fascinated despite herself. Merry Mrs. Carmichael had an idea. She'd discovered where he was staying, and she learned from one of the hotel maids that he'd put his winnings in a safe in his room. The safe was old, the type with a simple lock. Mary had certain skills she'd learned lockpicking from her late husband, who'd been a locksmith. She suggested we steal the money. There was a shocked silence. And you did? Miss Marple asked. We did. We justified it by telling ourselves that he'd won the money by luck anyway, that he was a boorish drunk who wouldn't really miss it, that we needed it more than he did. All the usual excuses people make when they do something they know is wrong. We broke into his room one night while he was at the casino, opened the safe, and took the money. Then we left Monte Carlo the next day and returned to England. We split the money for ways. It came to about £12,000 each. A fortune in those days. And that's how you all came to be financially comfortable, Miss Marple said. It wasn't a question. Yes, we invested it carefully, lived modestly, and made it last. It bought us independence, security, comfortable retirements. But we always knew it was stolen money. We agreed never to speak of it again, never to see each other again, to go our separate ways and forget it had ever happened. But you couldn't forget, Miss Marple observed. No, as we grew older, as our lives became more isolated, we found ourselves thinking about those days, about the one time in our lives when we'd been bold and reckless and alive, about the friends we'd shared it with. So we decided to come together again, to spend our final years near each other. We thought the past was safely buried, but someone new, Miss Marple said. Someone new, Miss Price agreed, her voice breaking. The poison pen letters started about 6 months ago. They all said the same thing. Thieves will be punished. We tried to ignore them, but they kept coming. And now Agnes and Mary are dead, and she looked at Miss Marple with eyes full of fear. Emily and I will be next, won't we? Not if we can help it, Miss Marple said firmly. Miss Price, do you have any idea who might have discovered your secret? Did the American ever find you? Did he know your names? I don't know. He knew our first names. We were staying at the same hotel, and we'd been introduced at dinner one evening. But I don't think he knew our surnames. And I don't believe he ever discovered who'd robbed him. The police were called, but we'd left by then, and there was no reason to connect us to the theft. Was there anyone else who knew what you'd done? Miss Marple asked. Miss Price hesitated. There was one person, a A chambermaid at the hotel, a young English girl named Rose something. She saw us coming back to our rooms that night, late, and she looked at us strangely. I always wondered if she'd guessed. But that was 20 years ago. She could be anywhere by now. She could even be dead. Or she could be here in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple said quietly, living under another name, waiting for the right moment to take revenge. But why? Miss Price cried. Why would a chambermaid care about a theft she wasn't involved in? Perhaps it's not about the theft itself, Miss Marple suggested. Perhaps it's about something else entirely. Something that happened as a consequence of the theft. That's what we need to discover. She rose to her feet. Miss Price, you must take precautions. Don't let anyone into your house whom you don't know well. Don't accept food or drink from anyone. And I would strongly suggest that you go to stay with Miss Barton. 2 people together are safer than 1 alone. Yes, Miss Price said shakily. Yes, I'll do that. I'll go there today. We'll come with you, Mrs. Bantry said. We need to warn Miss Barton anyway. Where does she live? She has a small cottage on the other side of the village Danemead. It's just off the main road, past the church. As they left Primrose Cottage, Miss Marple was thinking furiously. The story Miss Price had told explained much the connection between the 4 women. Their comfortable financial circumstances, the poison pen letters. But it didn't explain everything. Why had the murders happened now, after 20 years? And what was the significance of the chambermaid, Rose? More importantly, there was something Miss Price had said that didn't quite fit, a small detail that nagged at Miss Marple's mind like a loose thread that needed pulling. But she couldn't quite grasp what it was. They were halfway to Danemead when Dr. Haydock's car pulled up beside them. Miss Marple. He called through the window. I've been looking for you. Inspector Slack wants to see you immediately at the police station. There's been a development. What sort of development? Miss Marple asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. Another poison pen letter. It was delivered to the police station this morning. It's addressed to the fools of St. Mary Mead, and it says, he paused, his face grim. It says to down, to go. Justice will be served. Miss Marple's hands tightened on her handbag. Then we have very little time. The question was, would they figure it out before the killer struck again? Danemead was a modest cottage, smaller and less well appointed than either Rose Cottage or Primrose Cottage. It sat back from the road, partially hidden by overgrown shrubbery, and had an air of genteel neglect about it. The garden was wild, the paint on the window frames was peeling, and the whole property suggested someone living on a very limited income. Miss Marple noted this with interest as Dr. Haydock's car pulled up in front. If Miss Barton had received the same £12,000 as the others from the Monte Carlo theft, she appeared to have managed it far less successfully than her companions. They knocked on the door, and after a lengthy wait, it was opened by a tiny, bird-like woman with faded fair hair and anxious blue eyes. Miss Emily Barton looked every day of her 65 years, and then some. She was dressed in an old-fashioned frock that had seen better days, and her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were red and chapped from work. Miss Barton, Miss Marple said gently. I'm Miss Marple, and this is Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Haydock. Might we come in? We have some important matters to discuss with you. Oh dear, Miss Barton fluttered. The house is such a mess. I wasn't expecting visitors, but yes, of course, do come in. The interior of the cottage confirmed Miss Marple's impression. The furniture was shabby, the carpets worn thin, and there was a general air of things being carefully mended and made do with. A small fire burned in the grate, barely adequate to heat the room and the tea service. When Miss Barton nervously brought it out, was chipped and mismatched. Miss Barton, Miss Marple began, deciding that directness was the kindest approach. We need to talk to you about something that happened 20 years ago. In Monte Carlo, the effect was electric. Miss Barton's cup rattled in its saucer, and what little color she had drained from her face. Monte Carlo? I'm not sure what you mean, please, Miss Marple said gently. We've already spoken with Miss Price. We know about the theft, about the money, about the four of you being friends. We're not here to judge, we're here to help. Because someone is killing the women from that photograph. And unless we can discover who and why, you and Miss Price are in grave danger. Miss Barton stared at her for a long moment, then burst into tears. I knew it would come to this, she sobbed. I knew we'd be punished eventually. Agnes and Mary both dead. It's judgment, that's what it is. Divine judgment for what we did. It's not divine judgment, Mrs. Bantry said bracingly. It's human murder, and murders can be solved, and murderers caught. But you must tell us everything you know. Gradually, through the tears and the nervous fluttering, they pieced together Miss Barton's story. It largely confirmed what Miss Price had told them, but with some additional details. The American's name had been Randolph T. Garrison, a wealthy businessman from Chicago who'd won nearly 50,000 francs at roulette. The theft had been carefully planned over several days, with Mary Carmichael doing the actual breaking and entering while the others stood watch. But something went wrong, Miss Barton said, twisting her handkerchief in her hands. When we got back to our hotel that night, there was such a commotion. We learned the next day that Mr. Garrison had returned to his room earlier than expected. He'd felt ill and left the casino. He'd surprised a burglar on us, someone else entirely, and there'd been a fight. Mr. Garrison died. He had a weak heart, you see, and the shock and the struggle killed him. Good Lord, Dr. Haydock exclaimed. So your theft became murder, not our theft. Miss Barton cried. We didn't kill him. We weren't even there when it happened. But you always wondered if your theft had somehow precipitated the events that led to his death, Miss Marple said quietly. That's what you meant by divine judgment, isn't it? You've always felt guilty. Yes, Miss Barton whispered. Yes, we took his money, and then he was killed, and it felt like our fault. We agreed never to speak of it again, to try to make amends through good works and charitable living. But guilt doesn't fade, Miss Marple. It just grows heavier with the years. What happened to the other burglar? Miss Marple asked. The one who actually killed Mr. Garrison. He was caught, Miss Barton said. A man named Pierre Duclos, a French petty criminal. He was tried and convicted of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. 20 years in prison, which means he would have been released approximately. When, oh my God, Mrs. Bantry breathed. Recently, within the past few months. Exactly, Miss Marple said. Miss Barton, do you remember anything about this Pierre Duclos? Did you ever see him? Only in the newspapers. He was about 40 at the time, I think. Dark-haired French, not particularly I don't think I'd recognize him if I saw him today. But he might recognize you, Miss Marple pointed out. If he'd been watching the hotel, planning his own robbery, he might have seen the four of you. He might even have known or guessed what you'd done. But why would he want to kill us? Miss Barton asked desperately. We didn't do anything to him. didn't you? Miss Marple said. Think about it. He was caught because he returned to steal from a room that had already been robbed by you. If the money had still been there, he might have taken it and left without confronting Mr. Garrison. But it was gone. So he searched for it, and Mr. Garrison woke up and tried to stop him. And there was a struggle. In a sense, your theft led directly to his crime. I imagine he spent 20 years in prison thinking about that, blaming you for his fate. But how would he even know who we were? Dr. Haydock objected. Miss Price said he wouldn't have known their surnames. There was the chambermaid, Miss Marple reminded them. Rose, she saw them that night. If Pierre de Clos had an accomplice, a woman, perhaps she might have been working at the hotel. She might have known exactly who the 4 women were. Rose, Miss Barton said suddenly. Rose de Clos. Oh dear God, that was her full name. I remember now there was a scandal after the murder. One of the chambermaids was questioned because she was Pierre de Clos's sister. But she had an alibi for the night of the murder, so she wasn't charged with anything. His sister, Miss Marple repeated. That would certainly provide a motive for revenge. She watches her brother go to prison for 20 years for a crime that might have been avoided. If you 4 hadn't stolen the money first. She learns your names, perhaps even your backgrounds. And then, when her brother is finally released, they come to England together to take revenge. But where are they now? Mrs. Bantry demanded. If they're in St. Mary Mead, surely someone would have noticed strangers. Not if they're not strangers, Miss Marple said quietly. Not if they'd been here for some time, establishing themselves as respectable members of the community. There was a stunned silence as the implications sank in. You think the murderer is someone we know, Dr. Haydock said. Someone we see regularly, who's been living among us, planning these murders. I think it's very possible, Miss Marple said. Consider the facts. The murderer knew where Mrs. Fortescue and Mrs. Carmichael lived. They had access to digitalis, which suggests either medical knowledge or access to someone with heart medication. They were able to approach both women without arousing suspicion. Mrs. Carmichael even used her good china, which suggests she was pleased to see her visitor. And they've been sending poison pen letters for months, watching and waiting for the right moment. But who? Miss Barton asked desperately. Who in the village could it be? Before Miss Marple could answer, there was a sharp knock at the door. They all froze. Don't answer it, Mrs. Bantry whispered, but the door opened anyway. Miss Barton had, apparently, failed to lock it after their arrival, and a figure stepped into the cottage. It was Miss Lavinia Price. I saw Dr. Haydock's car outside, she said, slightly breathless. I thought I should come. If we're both in danger, Emily, it makes sense for us to stay together. Then she paused, taking in their expressions. What's wrong? What's happened? Miss Marple studied her carefully. Miss Price looked genuinely concerned, but there was something else in her expression, attention, a watchfulness. We've been discussing Pierre de Clos and his sister Rose, Miss Marple said evenly, and how they might have tracked you all down. Miss Price's face went very still. I see. And have you worked out who they might be? Not yet, Miss Marple admitted. But I will. Miss Price, you said earlier that you'd been giving piano lessons to the Weatherby children yesterday afternoon. What time were those lessons? From 2 until 4. Why? And can the Weatherbys confirm that? Of course they can, Miss Price said, her voice cooling. Miss Marple, are you suggesting that I'm suggesting nothing, Miss Marple said. I'm merely establishing facts. Miss Barton, where were you yesterday afternoon? Here, Miss Barton said nervously. I was here all day. I had a sick headache and didn't go out. Can anyone confirm that? No, I live alone. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I see. And Miss Price, you live alone as well? Yes, what of it? Simply that being alone means no alibi. It works both ways. Of course, it means you're vulnerable to attack, but it also means your movements can't be verified. Miss Price drew herself up with dignity. Miss Marple, I understand you're trying to solve these murders, but I must protest at your implication. I've told you everything I know. If you don't trust me, I shall return home. Please don't, Miss Marple said quickly. You're quite right I'm being overly suspicious. It's just that I feel as though we're missing something obvious, and it's making me question everything. But as Miss Price settled into a chair, Miss Marple's mind was working furiously. There was something wrong with Miss Price's story, something that didn't quite fit. But what was it? The conversation continued, going over and over the same ground, but Miss Marple found her attention wandering. Her eyes moved around the shabby little cottage, noting the worn furniture, the carefully mended curtains, the absence of any objects of value. And suddenly it clicked. Miss Barton was poor. Obviously, unmistakably poor. Living in a run-down cottage, wearing old clothes, heating only one room to save on coal. This was not how someone with £12,000 invested wisely would be living. Miss Barton, she said abruptly, interrupting a discussion about door locks. What happened to your share of the money from Monte Carlo? Miss Barton's face crumpled. I lost it, she whispered. Almost all of it. I invested it in a company that a friend recommended. Seemed so secure, such good returns. But it was a fraud. The company collapsed, and I lost everything. That was about 15 years ago. I've been living on a tiny pension ever since. Did the others know? Miss Marple asked. Yes, they were kind about it. They even offered to help me financially. But I was too proud to accept. I'd been foolish, and I had to live with the consequences. Miss Marple sat very still, thinking. This changed things. If Miss Barton had lost her money while the others had kept theirs, it created a different dynamic entirely. And suddenly, another thought struck her, one that made her go cold. Miss Price, she said carefully, when you came to St. Mary Mead 5 years ago, did you choose your house yourself? Yes, of course. Why? And Miss Barton, when you came 3 years ago, did Miss Price or any of the others help you find this cottage? Mary Carmichael did, actually. She said she knew of a place that would be perfect for my budget. She arranged everything. Why? Because, Miss Marple said slowly, I'm beginning to think we may have been looking at this from the wrong angle entirely. But before she could elaborate, there was a scream from outside her. Terrible, piercing scream that cut through the afternoon quiet. They all rushed to the door. In the lane outside, Mrs. Crump, Mrs. Fortescue's daily woman, was standing with her hands to her face, staring at something on the ground. It was a body, a woman's body, sprawled on the wet gravel, her eyes staring sightlessly at the grey sky. Dr. Haydock pushed past and knelt beside the body, checking for a pulse, though it was obviously futile. Dead, he said grimly, and from the looks of it, poisoned. Same as the others. Who is it? Mrs. Bantry asked, her voice shaking. Dr. Haydock rolled the body over gently. It was Diana Marston, the librarian from the village lending library, and suddenly, Miss Marple understood everything. Inspector Slack arrived within 10 minutes, summoned by Dr. Haydock's urgent telephone call, and found himself facing not 2 murders, but 3. His face was red with frustration and mounting anger as he surveyed the scene. Another woman dead, another poisoning, and apparently no one had seen or heard anything suspicious. "This is intolerable," he shouted, pacing back and forth in Miss Barton's small sitting room where they'd all been herded for questioning. 3 murders in 2 days. In a village where everyone supposedly knows everyone else's business, and not one useful witness. "Actually, Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe Mrs. Crump may have seen something useful. If you'd care to question her properly." Mrs. Crump, who'd been given sweet tea for shock and was sitting pale and trembling by the fire, looked up with frightened eyes. "I don't know nothing, Miss Marple. I was just walking past on my way home from the shops when I saw her lying there. But you came from the village, didn't you?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Along this lane, and Miss Marston's body was lying quite close to Miss Barton's gate." "Yes, miss. So you must have passed several cottages on your way. Did you see Miss Marston earlier? Was she walking ahead of you, or did she emerge from somewhere?" Mrs. Crump frowned, concentrating. "Now you mention it, I think I did see her, just for a moment. She was coming out of a gate a few houses back. I couldn't say which one exactly. There's several cottages along here. She was walking quickly, like she was in a hurry. And then she just stumbled and fell. I thought she'd tripped at first. But when I got to her, she shuddered." "Which direction was she walking?" Miss Marple asked. "Away from the village. Toward the fields," like Inspector Slack had been listening with barely concealed impatience. "That doesn't tell us anything useful. The woman was poisoned, presumably before she left whatever house she'd been visiting. We need to search every cottage in this lane and find out where she'd been." "I can tell you where she'd been," Miss Marple said calmly. "She'd been to visit me." There was a stunned silence. "You?" Inspector Slack's voice was sharp with suspicion. "Why didn't you mention this before?" "Because I didn't realize until just now that the woman Mrs. Crump saw was Miss Marston. I received a visitor about 40 minutes ago. Someone knocked at my door, but when I answered it, there was no one there. I assumed it was village children playing a prank. But I did see a woman walking quickly away down the lane. I didn't see her face, just her back. She was wearing a brown coat and a felt hat, which is what Miss Marston is wearing now. But why would she come to your door and then leave without speaking to you?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "I don't think she came to speak to me," Miss Marple said. "I think she came to observe me, or to see if I was at home." Or her voice grew thoughtful, "to deliver something." "Like what?" Inspector Slack demanded. "I'm not certain, but I think we should check my cottage very carefully." Inspector Slack sent Constable Polk to do just that, with strict instructions to touch nothing and report anything unusual. In the meantime, he turned his attention to Diana Marston's background. "The librarian," he said, consulting his notes. "Unmarried, aged about 55, lived alone in rooms above the lending library. Originally from London, came to St. Mary Mead about 8 years ago. Quiet, respectable, no known enemies. Anyone know her well?" "She kept largely to herself," Miss Price said. "I borrowed books regularly, of course, but she wasn't one for chatting. Professional but distant. She had a brother who visited occasionally. Miss Barton volunteered. I saw him once or twice, a foreign-looking gentleman, dark-haired. He had an accent, though I couldn't place it. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A foreign-looking gentleman with an accent. When did you last see him? Oh, not recently. It must have been several years ago, now I think about it. I haven't seen him in ages. Or perhaps you have, Miss Marple murmured. But you didn't recognize him. Before anyone could ask what she meant, Constable Pock returned, carrying something wrapped in his handkerchief. Inspector, I found this on Miss Marple's doorstep, tucked just behind the milk bottles. Looks like it was meant to be hidden, but easy enough for Miss Marple to find when she went to fetch her milk. Inspector Slack unwrapped the handkerchief to reveal a small brown bottle. The label read, Digitalis. For heart conditions. Take as directed. Good God, Dr. Haydock breathed. That's the poison that killed all 3 women. And someone was trying to frame Miss Marple for the murders, Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. How absolutely diabolical. Not frame, perhaps, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Or at least, not only frame. I think it was meant as a warning. Or possibly as a threat drink. This and you'll die too. Inspector Slack was examining the bottle. There's no prescription label, no chemist's name. Could have come from anywhere. He looked at Miss Marple with grudging respect. You may have had a narrow escape, Miss Marple. If you'd touched this bottle, or if we'd found it without knowing how it got there, you might have been arrested for murder. I don't think the murderer really wanted me arrested, Miss Marple said. I think they wanted me frightened. Possibly they wanted me to stop investigating. Which means you're getting close to the truth, Dr. Haydock observed. Perhaps, Miss Marple acknowledged. Or perhaps they simply want to confuse matters further. Inspector, I think we need to look very carefully at Diana Marston's life. Specifically, at when she came to St. Mary Mead and why. 8 years ago, Inspector Slack said. That was before any of these 4 women. He gestured at Miss Price, and Miss Barton had settled here. Before Mrs. Fortescue, certainly. Yes, Miss Marple said, which is very interesting indeed. Miss Price, you said Mary Carmichael had the idea to settle in St. Mary Mead, and she came here first. When exactly did she arrive? About 7 years ago, I believe. So Diana Marston was already here. Already established as the librarian, a respectable member of the community, someone above suspicion. You think she was waiting for them? Mrs. Bantry asked. I think it's possible. Inspector, did Diana Marston have any connection to Monte Carlo or to France? Inspector Slack consulted his notes. According to her initial registration with the village, she listed her previous residence as London. Before that, he flipped through the page. There were headshakes all around. I have a photograph, Miss Barton said suddenly. At least, I think I do. Last year, there was a village fete, and someone was taking photographs of everyone. I bought several copies. I thought it would be nice to have memories of village life. Let me look. She rummaged in a drawer and produced a folder of photographs. They pored over them together. Images of the church fete, the flower show, various village gatherings. And there, in one corner of a photograph taken at the summer fete, was Diana Marston standing next to a dark-haired man of about 60, both holding cups of tea. That's him, Miss Barton said. That's the brother I saw. Dr. Haydock peered at the photograph. He does look familiar, somehow, but I can't place him. That's because you're looking at him now, 20 years older, Miss Marple said quietly. But if you imagine him 20 years younger, with darker hair and a different expression. She held the photograph up next to the group picture from Monte Carlo. Look at the shape of the face, the set of the eyes. allow for aging and for the poor quality of the newspaper photograph Miss Barton mentioned seeing of Pierre de... I believe this man is Pierre de... and Diana Marsden was his sister, rose to close. The silence that followed was absolute. They've been here all along, Miss Price whispered. Living among us, planning their revenge. Yes, Miss Marple said. Rose came first, establishing herself as the librarian, a position that allowed her to observe everyone in the village, to learn about everyone's business through the books they read and the gossip they shared. When she learned that Mary Carmichael was planning to move here, she said nothing, just watched and waited. And when all four of you were finally settled in St. Mary Mead, she sent for her brother. He'd been released from prison by then, and together they began their plan of revenge. But why is she dead? Mrs. Bantry asked. If she was one of the murderers, who killed her? That, said Miss Marple, is the question that changes everything. Because you're quite right, if Rose Declus was one of the murderers, who murdered her? The only answer is her brother, Pierre. But why would he kill his own sister, his accomplice? A falling out among thieves, Inspector Slack suggested. Perhaps she wanted to stop, and he wouldn't let her. Perhaps, Miss Marple said slowly. Or perhaps she paused, her mind working through the implications of a new theory. Or perhaps we've had this wrong from the very beginning. Perhaps Pierre de Close isn't the murderer at all. Then who is? Inspector Slack demanded. I'm not quite certain yet, Miss Marple admitted. But I'm beginning to see the outline of the truth. And if I'm right, it's far more clever and far more terrible than any of us imagined. She stood up, brushing down her skirt with a decisive gesture. Inspector, I need to ask you to do something rather unusual. I need you to call everyone together, everyone who might possibly be involved in this case. The vicar, Miss Hartnell, Mrs. Price Ridley, Stephen Fortescue, if he's still in the village, young Peter Devlin, and anyone else who's been closely connected to the victims. Bring them all to the vicarage in 2 hours. I believe I can reveal the murderer, but I need to test my theory first. Inspector Slack looked dubious. That's most irregular, Miss Marple. I can't just call a village meeting to unmask a murderer like some detective in a novel. Why not? Miss Marple asked reasonably. It's certainly more efficient than arresting the wrong person, which I suspect you're about to do. Unless, of course, you've solved the case yourself. Inspector Slack's face reddened. I have several promising leads, which are all wrong, Miss Marple said with gentle firmness. Trust me, Inspector. I've been observing human nature in villages for 70 years. I know how these things work. Give me 2 hours, and I'll give you your murderer. Colonel Melchett, who'd been listening quietly to the entire exchange, intervened. I think we should let Miss Marple try. Slack. She's been right about things before. What harm can it do? And so, with great reluctance, Inspector Slack agreed, as Miss Marple left Danemead and made her way slowly back to her own cottage. Her mind was putting the final pieces together. She thought she knew now who the murderer was, and how it had all been done. But there was still one thing that troubled her, one question that needed answering before she could be completely certain. Why had the murderer killed Diana Marsden? That was the key to everything. Once she understood that, the rest would fall into place, and she had 2 hours to figure it out. Miss Marple's cottage was quiet when she returned. The familiar rooms welcoming after the drama of the afternoon. She made herself a pot of tea, carefully checking the tea leaves first, a precaution that seemed necessary given recent events. and settled into her favorite chair by the window to think. The photograph from Monte Carlo lay on the table beside her, and she studied it once more. For young women, laughing and carefree, celebrating their successful theft. They couldn't have known then how that one act would echo through the decades, culminating in murder. But whose murder, and why? She picked up her knitting. She always thought better, while Knitting Hand let her mind work through the problem systematically. 3 women were dead. Agnes Fortescue, Mary Carmichael, and Diana Marston Rose Close. 2 women were still alive, Lavinia Price and Emily Barton. The obvious theory was that Pierre Duclos was systematically murdering the 4 women who'd robbed the American, taking revenge for his 20 years in prison. But that theory had collapsed with his sister's death. Pierre Duclos couldn't be the murderer if he'd murdered his own sister unless there was a reason for him to do so, Miss Marple. Needles clicked steadily as she considered this. What reason could Pierre Duclos have for killing his sister? A falling out? Possible, but unlikely. They'd been planning this revenge for months, possibly years. Money, but there was no money to fight over. The theft they were avenging had happened 20 years ago, and any proceeds would be long gone, unless... Miss Marple's hands stilled as a new thought struck her. Unless there had been another theft. A more recent one. She set down her knitting and reached for the newspaper clippings she'd asked Constable Polk to fetch. From the library, earlier articles about Diana Marston from when she'd first arrived in the village 8 years ago. She read them again carefully, paying attention to details she'd glossed over before. Miss Diana Marston, formerly of London, has taken up the position of village librarian. Miss Marston brings with her extensive experience in library management and a love of literature. She told our reporter that she was looking forward to a quiet life in the countryside after many years in the city. Quiet life in the countryside. After many years in the city. Doing what? Being a secretary for a shipping company, according to her village registration. But was that true? Miss Marple made a mental note to ask Inspector Slack to verify Diana Marston's employment history. Something told her it might reveal interesting discrepancies. She moved on to the next question. Why had Mary Carmichael helped Emily Barton find a cottage? On the surface, it was a friendly gesture. But Miss Marple had learned over the years that actions often had multiple motives. Had Mary Carmichael wanted Emily Barton nearby? Or had she wanted her somewhere specific? Danemead was isolated, at the end of a lane, with no near neighbours. Easy to watch, hard for Emily Barton to observe others without being obvious about it. If Mary Carmichael had been keeping secrets, having Emily Barton tucked away in an isolated cottage would be convenient. But what secrets? And from whom? Miss Marple's eyes fell on the photograph again, and suddenly she saw it with new eyes. For women, yes, but look at their positions, their body language. 3 of them, Agnes Fortescue, Mary Carmichael, and one other, were close together, arms linked, clearly intimate friends. The 4th woman stood slightly apart, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Which woman was that? Miss Marple peered at the photograph more closely, trying to match the young faces to the older women she'd known. Agnes Fortescue was easy to identify, and Mary Carmichael's strong features were distinctive even in youth. That left Lavinia Price and Emily Barton. One of them had been the close friend, part of the inner circle. The other had been slightly apart, perhaps less involved in the planning, less enthusiastic about the scheme. Which was which? Miss Marple thought back to her conversations with both women. Emily Barton had been nervous, guilt-ridden, clearly uncomfortable discussing the Monte Carlo theft. Lavinia Price had been more controlled, more matter-of-fact, as though the theft was simply an unfortunate incident from the past rather than a source of ongoing guilt. But was that the behavior of someone who'd been deeply involved, or someone who'd been peripheral? It could go either way. Miss Marple checked her watch. She had 45 minutes before the gathering at the vicarage. Time for one more test. The final test that would confirm her theory. She rose, put on her hat and coat, and walked briskly to Primrose Cottage. Miss Price answered the door immediately, as though she'd been watching for visitors. Miss Marple, have you solved it? Do you know who the murderer is? I have a theory, Miss Marple said carefully, but I need to ask you one more question. It's rather delicate, but it's important, of course. Come in. Once they were seated in the elegant sitting room, Miss Marple. Yes, that's right. And Emily Barton lost her share in a fraudulent investment about 15 years ago. Yes, poor thing. She was devastated. But you kept your share, invested it wisely, and have lived comfortably on it ever since. Yes. Miss Price looked puzzled. Why is this important? I think it might be. You see, I've been thinking about the nature of guilt and revenge. If Pierre Duclos wanted revenge for his imprisonment, he would target the women who'd stolen the money that led to his crime. But there's another person who might want revenge, someone who'd been directly harmed by the theft. You mean the American? Mr. Garrison. But he's dead. Yes, he is. But what if he had family? A wife, children, who were left destitute by his death. They would have lost not only a husband and father, but also the money he'd won, money that would have secured their future. Miss Price's face went pale. I never thought of that. But surely after 20 years is a long time to nurse a grievance, Miss Marple said. Particularly if one has lived in poverty because of someone else's theft. Tell me, Miss Price, when Mary Carmichael first suggested settling in St. Mary Mead, did she mention why she'd chosen this particular village? She said it was peaceful and affordable, and that she'd visited once and fallen in love with it. Why, I'm wondering if perhaps someone else chose it first, and she simply followed. Someone who'd been here long enough to establish themselves as trustworthy and above suspicion. Miss Price's eyes widened as she understood. Diana Marsden. You think Diana Marsden was connected to Mr. Garrison? But you said she was Rose Duclos Pierre's sister. I said she might be. But what if I was wrong? What if Diana Marsden wasn't Rose Duclos at all, but someone else entirely? Someone who had a different reason for revenge. But the brother Miss Barton saw could have been anyone. A real brother, a friend, an accomplice. We only have Miss Barton's word that he resembled Pierre Duclos, and that was based on a newspaper photograph from 20 years ago. Miss Marple rose to her feet. Thank you, Miss Price. You've been very helpful. I'll see you at the vicarage shortly. As she walked to the vicarage for the final confrontation, Miss Marple's mind was clear. She knew who the murderer was now, and how it had been done. But she also knew that proving it would require the murderer to reveal themselves too. Make one final mistake. It was time to set the trap. The vicarage drawing room was crowded when Miss Marple arrived. Inspector Slack had done as she'd asked, gathering everyone who might be connected to the case. Stephen Fortescue sat rigidly in one corner, his face drawn. Miss Lavinia Price and Miss Emily Barton sat together on the sofa, holding hands for mutual support. Miss Hartnell occupied a prominent chair, quivering with excitement. Mrs. Price Ridley sat with magisterial disapproval. clearly feeling that such theatrics were beneath the dignity of proper investigation. Dr. Haydock stood by the fireplace, and Colonel Melchett sat next to Inspector Slack, both looking skeptical but willing to give Miss Marple her chance. Mrs. Bantry, the vicar, and his wife completed the assembly. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began in her gentle voice. "I know this is unusual, but I believe I can shed light on these terrible murders, and I thought it best to do so with everyone present, so there can be no misunderstandings." "Get on with it then," Inspector Slack said impatiently. "Who's the murderer?" "Before I reveal that," Miss Marple said, "I need to explain how I reached my conclusion. Because this case, you see, has been a masterpiece of misdirection from the very beginning." She paused, looking around the room at the assembled faces. "When Mrs. Fortescue was murdered, we all assumed it was about inheritance, that her nephew Stephen might have killed her for money. Then Mrs. Carmichael died, and we realized the murders were connected. The photograph from Monte Carlo revealed that the two women had been friends 20 years ago, and that they'd been involved in a theft. We learned about Pierre Duclos and his sister Rose, and we assumed they were taking revenge for his imprisonment." "And you're saying that's not true?" Colonel Melchett asked. "I'm saying it's partly true and partly false. Yes, the murders are revenge for something that happened in Monte Carlo in 1930, but not revenge from Pierre Duclos. The revenge comes from someone else entirely. Someone who's been far more clever and patient than a career criminal ever could be." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew several sheets of paper. "Inspector Slack was kind enough to make some inquiries for me this afternoon. These are the results. First, the employment history of Diana Marston. She did not, as claimed, work for a shipping company. She worked as a nurse, specifically, a private nurse to wealthy elderly patients. There was a murmur of surprise. Second, the background of Mr. Randolph T. Garrison, the American who was killed in Monte Carlo. He was a widower, but he had one child, a daughter named Dorothy, who was about 15 at the time of his death. Dorothy Garrison was left penniless by her father's death. The money he'd won at the casino, the money that was stolen, would have secured her future. Instead, she was forced to leave school and work for her living." Miss Marple paused, letting this sink in. "Dorothy Garrison became a nurse. She worked hard, saved her money, and eventually came to England. She changed her name and her identity, and she settled in St. Mary Mead, where she waited for the women who'd stolen her father's money and contributed to his death to come to her. Diana Marston was Dorothy Garrison." Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, "I believe so. It's why she came here before any of the four women did. She'd researched them, learned that Mary Carmichael was planning to settle here, and established herself in position first. As the librarian, she could observe everyone, learn everyone's secrets, wait for her moment." "But why wait so long?" Inspector Slack demanded. "Why not just kill them as soon as they arrived?" "Because revenge is sweetest when the victim suffers," Miss Marple said quietly. "Diana Marston didn't want them just dead. She wanted them to suffer first. So she sent poison pen letters, created fear and suspicion, made them live in dread. And then, when she was ready, she struck. But she's dead herself." Miss Hartnell protested. "Who killed her?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is where the story becomes truly interesting. Because Diana Marsden had an accomplice, someone who helped her plan the murders, who perhaps even carried them out. And when that accomplice realized that Diana Marsden was becoming a liability, that she might expose them both, they killed her too." The room was absolutely silent now. everyone staring at Miss Marple. The accomplice, Miss Marple continued, was someone who also had a grudge against the 4 women from Monte Carlo. Someone who'd been hurt by what they'd done, who'd harbored resentment for years. Someone who saw in Diana Marston's plan an opportunity for their own revenge. She turned to look directly at Emily Barton. "Wasn't it, Miss Barton?" Emily Barton looked up with wide, frightened eyes. "Me? But I don't understand." "Why would I? I'm one of the victims. One of the women from Monte Carlo." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "You were. But you were also the woman who lost everything. While the others invested their stolen money and prospered, you lost yours to a fraud. You spent 15 years living in poverty, watching your former friends living comfortably on money that you no longer had. That must have bred considerable resentment. But that wasn't their fault." Emily Barton cried. "They offered to help me, and you refused because of pride. But pride can turn to bitterness, can't it? Especially when one is alone and poor and lonely, while one's former friends are comfortable and secure." Inspector Slack was leaning forward now, interested despite himself. "You're saying Miss Barton killed her own friends out of jealousy? That seems rather far-fetched." "I'm saying that Emily Barton helped Diana Marsden kill her friends," Miss Marple corrected. "And I can prove it. Miss Barton, would you mind showing us your hands?" "My hands?" Emily Barton looked confused, but she extended her hands. They were, as Miss Marple had noted before, red and chapped from work. "You do your own housework, don't you? Cook your own meals, scrub your own floors. You can't afford help." "Yes, but what?" "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "you managed to afford a rather expensive cameo brooch. I noticed it the first time I met you. It was pinned to your collar. Quite a valuable piece, I should say. Victorian, if I'm not mistaken, worth several £100 at least." Emily Barton's hand flew to her throat, but the brooch wasn't there today. I inherited it from my mother." "Did you? How interesting." "Because Miss Price has a similar brooch. She noticed it when we visited her earlier. And I'm quite certain that if we looked, we'd find that Mrs. Fortescue and Mrs. Carmichael each had one as well. For identical brooches, quite valuable. Almost as if they were purchased together, perhaps with stolen money in Monte Carlo." Emily Barton said nothing, but her face had gone very pale. "If you'd truly lost all your money," Miss Marple continued, "you would have sold that brooch years ago. The fact that you kept it suggests you weren't quite as penniless as you claimed, which made me wonder, what else had you lied about? This is all speculation." Emily Barton said desperately, "You have no proof." "Don't I? Let me tell you what I think happened. Diana Marston came to St. Mary Mead. She knew that you, Miss Barton, had lost your money and were living in reduced circumstances. She approached you perhaps at first just to talk, to share her story, to make you see how your theft had destroyed her life." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but her eyes were sharp, and she found a receptive audience. "You were bitter about your losses, angry at your friends who'd prospered while you suffered. Diana Marsden offered you a chance at revenge and at profit. If you helped her kill the others, you could take their place in their wills, inherit their money. After all, you were their friend who would suspect you. That's insane." Emily Barton stood up, her voice shaking. "I would never. You helped her plan everything," Miss Marple continued implacably. "The poison pen letters were your idea. You knew they'd frighten the others because you'd received one yourself. Or rather, you claimed you had, to deflect suspicion. You helped Diana Marston obtain the digitalis, perhaps you even administered it yourself, since you visited both women regularly and would be above suspicion. I have an alibi. Emily Barton cried. I was at home alone when Mary Carmichael was killed. Yes, but Diana Marsden wasn't. Diana Marsden visited Mary Carmichael, took tea with her using the good china, and poisoned her tea. You didn't commit that murder, Diana Marsden did, while you made sure you were visible elsewhere, establishing an alibi. Inspector Slack was nodding now. But why would Miss Barton kill Diana Marsden, her accomplice? Because Diana Marsden was becoming unstable, Miss Marple said. She'd taken her revenge on 2 of the 4 women. But she was starting to make mistakes, like trying to frame me by leaving the poison bottle at my cottage. Emily Barton realized that Diana was a liability, that she might confess or do something that would expose them both. So she decided to eliminate her partner. But I couldn't have killed Diana Marston, Emily Barton said triumphantly. She was poisoned in the lane outside my cottage, yes, but I was inside with all of you. You saw me there. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But Diana Marsden wasn't poisoned in the lane. She was poisoned earlier, somewhere else, and the poison took time to work. She came to my cottage not to frame me, but because you'd told her to meet you there. Perhaps you said you've discovered something important. She knocked on my door, but she was already feeling the effects of the poison. She turned away, trying to get back to her own home, or perhaps to seek help, and she collapsed in the lane outside your cottage. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. The question is, when did you poison her? And I realized it must have been yesterday evening. After we all left your cottage following the discovery of Mrs. Carmichael's body. You offered her tea or something else. Something she drank without suspicion because you were her partner, her accomplice. But you'd put enough digitalis in it to kill her slowly, over the course of 12 to 15 hours. Dr. Haydock spoke up. That's medically possible. A large enough dose of digitalis can take many hours to prove fatal, depending on the victim's constitution and what else they've consumed. You're making this all up. Emily Barton's voice was rising toward hysteria. You have no proof. No one saw me poison anyone. That's true, Miss Marple acknowledged. But I think if Inspector Slack searches your cottage very carefully, he'll find evidence of the poison. And I think if he checks your background more thoroughly, he'll discover that you and Diana Marsden knew each other before you came to St. Mary Mead, that your friendship didn't begin here but was established years earlier, when you were planning this revenge together. But even as Miss Marple spoke, she could see the calculation in Emily Barton's eyes. The woman was weighing her options, trying to decide whether to continue denying or to make a run for it. And then, suddenly, Emily Barton lunged toward the door. She was surprisingly fast for her age, but Inspector Slack was faster. He caught her arm and held her firmly while she struggled. Let me go. You can't prove anything. I haven't done anything wrong. Then you won't mind coming to the station for further questioning, Inspector Slack said grimly. And you won't mind us searching your cottage. If you're innocent, as you claim, you have nothing to fear. As Emily Barton was led away, still protesting, Miss Price spoke up in a shaken voice. Is it really true? Emily was behind all this. But she was my friend. We'd known each other for 20 years. I'm afraid, Miss Marple said gently, that friendship isn't always what we think it is. Resentment can masquerade as affection for a very long time, especially when someone feels they've been wronged. But what about the man Miss Barton mentioned? Mrs. Bantry asked. The brother that Diana Marston supposedly had. I suspect that was a fiction, Miss Marple said. Or possibly a real brother who knew nothing of his sister's plans. Miss Barton mentioned seeing him years ago, but no one else seems to have noticed him. It's possible she invented him to strengthen the Pierre Declos theory, to throw us off the scent. Colonel Melchett was looking at Miss Marple with frank admiration. That was remarkable detective work, Miss Marple. How did you figure it out? Small things, Miss Marple said. The cameo brooch that didn't fit with Miss Barton's poverty. The fact that she lived so close to where Diana Marsden collapsed, yet claimed not to have seen or heard anything. The way she'd been so quick to tell us about the Monte Carlo theft as if she wanted to direct our attention toward Pierre Declos and away from other possibilities. And most of all, the expression on her face when she looked at the photograph. There was bitterness there, not nostalgia. She paused, then added, and there was one other thing. When I mentioned that Mrs. Carmichael had used her good china for her visitor, Miss Price said it suggested someone she was pleased to see. But Miss Barton said nothing, because she already knew about the china. Diana Marsden had told her about it after poisoning Mrs. Carmichael's tea. Will you be able to prove all this, Inspector? Dr. Haydock asked. I believe so, Inspector Slack said, looking more cheerful than he had in days. If Miss Marple's theory is correct, we'll find evidence when we search Miss Barton's cottage, and we'll investigate the connection between her and Diana Marsden. If they knew each other before coming to St. Mary Mead, we'll find proof of it. What will happen to Miss Price now? The vicar asked quietly. She's the only one left of the four friends. Miss Price raised her head, and there were tears on her cheeks. I'll have to live with the knowledge that our theft 20 years ago led to all these deaths, she said. Agnes, Mary, Diana, and Emily all dead because of what we did in Monte Carlo. It's a high price for £12,000. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. Sin, I'm afraid, has a way of catching up with us eventually, though not always in the way we expect. As the gathering broke up, Stephen Fortescue approached Miss Marple. Thank you, he said quietly. I know I was a suspect. I'm grateful you looked beyond the obvious. The obvious, Miss Marple observed, is not always the truth. Though I must say, young man, you should be more careful with your finances in future. Desperate need for money is a dangerous thing. It leads people into all sorts of trouble. I've learned that lesson, Stephen Fortescue said soberly. Believe me, I have. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in her own cottage with Mrs. Bantry, reviewing the day's events over a reviving cup of tea. I still can't believe it was Emily Barton all along, Mrs. Bantry said. She seemed so harmless, so helpless. That, said Miss Marple, was precisely her strength. People underestimated her because she seemed weak and foolish. But beneath that fluttering exterior was a calculating mind and a bitter heart. She'd spent years resenting her friend's good fortune while she struggled. And when Diana Marsden offered her a chance at revenge and profit, she took it. Do you think they'll convict her? I believe so. Inspector Slack telephoned just before you arrived. They've found Digitalis in Miss Barton's cottage, hidden in a tea caddy. And they've discovered that she and Diana Marsden knew each other in London years ago. Long before either came to St. Mary Mead, they'd been planning this revenge together for quite some time. It's all so sad, Mrs. Bantry said. For women, friends once, and 3 of them dead, and 1 facing trial for murder. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. It's a cautionary tale, really. About how one wrong act, one theft committed in a moment of recklessness, can have consequences that echo for decades. and about how resentment, if allowed to fester, can turn into something poisonous and deadly. She picked up her knitting, her fingers working automatically. Human nature, she observed, is endlessly complex. We think we know people, but we often only know the face they choose to show us. That's why one must observe carefully, notice the small inconsistencies, the details that don't quite fit. They are often the key to the truth. "Well," said Mrs. Bantry, "I'm just grateful it's over. St. Mary Mead can go back to being its usual peaceful self. For now," Miss Marple said, with a slight smile. "Though I've found, over the years, that peace in a village is often temporary. Human beings are remarkably inventive when it comes to creating drama and trouble." Outside, the October dusk was falling over St. Mary Mead, and lights were beginning to appear in cottage windows all down the high street. The village would talk about the murders for months, perhaps years, but gradually life would return to normal. The vicar would preach his sermons, the church fete would be held as usual next summer, and the rhythm of village life would continue as it always had. But Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting, would continue to watch and observe and notice the small details that others missed, because she knew that wherever human beings gathered, there would always be passions and secrets and, sometimes, murder. It was simply a matter of human nature. The trial of Emily Barton took place 3 months later at the asylum, and it was, as the newspapers breathlessly reported, one of the most sensational cases in years. The respectable village spinster revealed to be a calculating murderer. The decades-old theft that had led to multiple deaths. The cold-blooded betrayal of friends, all of it made for compelling reading. Miss Marple attended the trial, sitting quietly in the gallery and observing with the same careful attention she brought to everything. Emily Barton had changed in the months since her arrests. The nervous, fluttering manner had vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, composed dignity that was far more chilling than any histrionics would have been. She pleaded not guilty, naturally, and her defense counsel constructed an elaborate theory about Diana Marsden being the sole murderer, with Miss Barton as merely an unfortunate acquaintance who'd been framed. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. The digitalis found in her cottage, the testimony about her long acquaintance with Diana Marsden, the financial records showing she'd been carefully hoarding money for years. Despite her appearance of poverty, of it painted a damning picture. And then there was Stephen Fortescue's testimony. Under questioning, he revealed that he'd seen Miss Barton leaving his aunt's cottage on the evening before her death, though at the time he'd thought nothing of it. She'd told him she'd been bringing Mrs. Fortescue some flowers from her gardener. Perfectly innocent explanation. But when the police searched her cottage, they found no evidence that she'd been gardening that autumn. Her small plot was overgrown and neglected. The flowers, the prosecution argued, had been merely an excuse to visit Mrs. Fortescue and poison her tea. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of murder. Emily Barton was sentenced to death, though that was later commuted to life imprisonment due to her age. When the verdict was read, she showed no emotion whatsoever. She simply stood, nodded once as though confirming something to herself, and allowed herself to be led away. Miss Marple found the whole thing profoundly sad. A month after the trial, on a cold February morning, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. It was Lavinia Price, looking older and more careworn than when Miss Marple had last seen her. "I'm leaving St. Mary Mead," she announced, without preamble. "I wanted to say goodbye, and to thank you. Thank me." Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "Whatever for?" "For saving my life," Miss Price said simply. "If you hadn't solved the case when you did, Emily